Hi, this is Dave Heckroth, and welcome to another round of Zilker Tech Talk. Today we're going to be chatting about decision management rule governance, specifically focused on the IBM ODM tool. We're going to keep this at a relatively high level today, chatting just about releases and deployments and their capability with the ODM product. This Tech Talk today is part of a whole series of tech topics, and this one falls into the intermediate 500-foot view. You can see that we've got tech talks all about, very high-level executive briefing overview, and then some very, very detailed tech talks as well. This one really falls into that middle category. As I said earlier, today's talk is going to concentrate mostly on the release processes and a little bit on the deployment capability in IBM's ODM. And we're going to talk just briefly about some of the enabling areas, change activities, validation activities, and just a little bit about testing. Okay, so let's start at the top. From just an overview perspective, some ask, what is decision governance or rule governance? And by the way, I use those two words, those two phrases interchangeably. You'll hear me throughout today. There is a subtle distinction between those two. But for today's topic, let's just call those the same thing. So from a short answer perspective, right, decision governance is all about managing the changes and the deployments of decision systems, right? Quite simple. But the longer answer, if you listen to IBM and some of their explanation on the topic, they're going to tell you that decision systems are managed from a governance perspective with their decision center console product. They have two. One is the primary, being the business console, and this allows business users to work with a ready-to-use life cycle process to manage the change activity of those decisions and the deployment properties of that decision as it goes from a development change environment to a rule execution server environment. But all those things aside, whether you like the short answer or the longer answer, most agree that when we govern decision systems, we include things like defining roles for the actors and the whole governance process. We're talking about a repeatable process to manage the change life cycle, right? We're talking about reporting capabilities to give clarity to the fact that the change activity is going as you expect. We're talking about tracking systems that allow auditing of previously run transactions or inquiries of the service. We're talking about the ability to do backups and restores and things of that nature. Some of these things we'll talk about in future tech talks. Like I said, today is just about the release process and the deployment process. We'll touch on some of these other things, but they'll be followed up in other tech talks. So moving on to the why do decision governance, right? Let's assume that you're all on board with decision governance from a technology perspective. Why do that? Well, clearly it's the whole idea of better managing and modeling those business processes by having a repeatable process to govern the changes and the deployment capability. You're going to have better communication with your stakeholders. You're going to have a more accurate change process and implementation process. You're going to be able to do that better, faster, and cheaper than just using manual change processes altogether. And when we try to apply changes to business decisions that are in an unmanaged way, we're always asking these type of questions, right? Am I going to break something? How do I undo a change? What's the impact of that change? When's that change effective? All these type of questions, that come about when we talk about managing decisions and the challenge of doing ungoverned decisions. So now that we all have an understanding of why managing decisions using decision governance approach is important, let's actually look at the release process as it relates to IBM's ODM product. Now, I've got a number of slides that I'm going to share, both for the release process and the deployment process from the business console. And then what I'll do is I'll drop into a demo and show you some of that activity live so you can get an appreciation for it. Okay, the following picture is one of the release process flow, if you want to think of it that way, kind of the release life cycle. And what it's meant to share is that when you first create a release object in ODM, it's given this in progress status, and it can migrate via a happy path in this direction to the right, where it gets assigned a status of ready to approve after all the activities have been applied in that release, and then ultimately when the approving cycle occurs, then it can then move to a complete status, and you can do some interesting deployment things to it. Now, in the event that you get to ready for approval status and it gets denied for one reason or another, there is like a reject path that you can follow in order to send it back to the in progress state so that you can then make your additional changes to that particular release, or you can then outright cancel it altogether. In addition to following that life cycle that we just saw, the governance process in ODM allows you to focus on how you do it with traditional software development, and that is you have a baseline or a main branch, and from that branch you can create releases or sub-branches that take on change activities of one type or another, and at various points in time you can create additional offshoots in order to take into account additional change processing that wasn't part of the original release. Right, so you've got release 1.0, it comes along, then partway through that, you can base a new release on a point in time of that first release, and then continue on with the release 1.1, merge 1.0 back into the baseline. Baseline shows 1.0. When release 1.1 is ready, you can compare those two releases. If there's anything that needs to be managed from a change perspective, you can do that, and it supports the merging process as well. I don't know that we're going to get into a lot of detail today about doing the merging part of the change process. I really just want to point out to you that could be done when and if you get to that level of complexity with your release management. Okay, now deployment. I want to share a couple of slides with you that talked about the deployment process and kind of helped us walk through that understanding. Then, of course, I'll show that in the live demo. Now, in terms of deploying from IBM's ODM product, once you've gone through that app lifecycle, you've made your changes to your business decision, you've validated those changes with some test cases and things of that nature. Now you're at the point where you're ready to deploy. And you've really got one of four options. If you are the developer, the IT type person who uses Rule Designer, this blue box area, you can deploy directly to the rule execution server, this area in gray. And that's done a lot. I would say that we find that about half of our clients do that deployment directly from Rule Designer because they don't have a big community making changes to the rules. But then let's take a leap over here to this yellow box. This is really the server-based area where you make modifications to the decisions themselves via the rules. You can do that through one of two consoles. Today, you can use the Enterprise console or you can use the Business console, even as high as version 8.8.1, which is I'll be showing you today. But we'll be focused primarily on this option 3 down here where the Business console is deploying to the rule execution server and the steps involved in that process. I'll certainly show you how to log into the Business console and navigate to the area where you do the deployments. But here's a snapshot. You can see that I have a couple of deployment configurations set up. And my decision service, I'm going to go ahead and deploy. Right? I can do that either by making a selection. I'll show you that in the demo. After you do deploy, there's a couple of things that happen. One, you get a report in IBM's ODM product that tells you a lot of the information about the deployment itself. And one of the things I want to draw your attention to is that it also provides you that version of the new deployment so that you can go out and verify and validate in the rule execution server. You can look at the rule set And on that rule set, you can see for a particular date, here is indeed the version, and kind of verify it against the information that was shown to you in the Business Console report. So next we're going to actually walk through some demos. So just one sec. Okay, so now we're going to do a demonstration of the release processing in ODM. And as you can see here, I have Decision Center Business Console up for ODM. Before I do that, I'm going to bring up an overview of the problem that we're going to be addressing. It's called TLP, and let me take just a minute and bring that up. Okay, so TLP is an insurance rating type challenge. It's one where we take advantage of some information from an applicant's package, an application. We determine things like financial stability of the applicant, property risk of the applicant, and coverage liability of the applicant, and all of those are used in order to determine what an applicant's final pricing tier is. And we can look at the knowledge as it's been broken down by this set of requirements, and we can see that in order to determine what a person's financial stability is, we need to understand a little bit about how many years they've been in business, number of bankruptcies they've had, things of that nature. And so you can just follow across from this data to determine what the rule is going to create here on the right-hand side. And the same is true when we talk about the property risk. In order to set the property risk to whatever value it is, in this case it's high, medium, or low, we need to know things like what type of construction is it, how many prior losses have they had, age of the property, property value, and on and on. Here's the information for the coverage liability. So you can see this challenge that we're addressing has a set of well understood, predefined requirements, and we're going to use those in our application today. Now, to make that go faster, I've already encoded all of that in ODM in a decision service, and I've actually pushed that decision service from my rule designer to Decision Center Business Console, and we can see I took everything else out. All we have is TLP. When it gets to Decision Center, this is what it's going to look like. We can click on TLP, and we can see that it has an initial release. This is the way it comes in from Rule Designer when it's ported to this environment. Now we're going to go ahead and create a new release. This is the container that's going to hold all of our new changes to that. In order to do that, I'm clicking on the plus button, and I'm going to fill out all this information. You can see I've just filled out all that information, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it go ahead and create that particular release. After I create that release, you can see that here in my main screen, my main decision service screen, I'm in the TLP application. I've still got the initial release out there. That's what I came in with from Rule Designer. But now I also have a release that's got the name that I gave it, Release 2016-10 for the October. And if I jump into that release, this has got all of the information that I'm used to seeing associated with a decision service. On this left-hand side, it's got a hierarchy view of the service, all of its components. In the middle pane here, it's got focus on whichever hierarchy view item I have selected. And then on the right-hand side, it has all the metadata associated with this particular release. You can see that it describes, who created it, the initial status for the release, who the owner is, and who the reviewer is. We can see that April, the approver, is the approver for this particular release. Now, if I click on the activities section of the release, I can see there's no activities yet. But if I want to make a change to this particular release, actually modify the code, I would not do that here at the release level. I would actually do that in a change activity. There's two major object types. You can see that it's got change activity or validation activity. And here what I'm going to enter is a change activity. I'll fill out this information. And after I fill out all the information, I'm going to hit create. And we're going to see in this window that it actually drops into the change activity. Let's go back to the release, and we can see a little bit of metadata about that change activity. We can see that it's obviously got the name, and over here on the right-hand side, we can see that this is an in-progress change activity. And then, of course, the metadata associated with the change activity here, the same way we had for the release. And so the idea is we'll go in and we'll make some changes to some rules, and then we'll be ready to deploy those rules to our rule execution server. So I'm actually going to walk through this relatively quickly. I'm going to enter the change activity. I can see all the decision artifacts. And what I want to do is I want to go into the pricing tier rules. And you can note there's little icons here that give me quick starts to this. I know that I want to enter this and edit it, so I'm going to click on the little pencil. And it's going to give me the ability to basically see how the rules are characterized here, whether they're going to be in some type of logic order, whether they're going to be in alphabetical order, and that was that previous screen. So what I want to do here is I want to change this rule number 10. In situations where it's poor, I want to denote high and not high by not referring it at this point, but I've got a new classification that my underwriters are going to deal with, and that's classification pricing tier level D. So I'm gonna try and make that happen. Go in here and then I'll hit save, and I can put in description as to what change request it was that caused this to happen. And at this point it gives me a view of the particular change. I confirm that that's what I want. I go back to the change activity and I can see that it's still in progress, but I know that I'm done, and I want to now go through the process of releasing this information to my rule execution server environment. And I see I've got quite a bit of this metadata still in progress, right? So the status of this is no longer in progress. I've made my change. Let's assume for a minute that I've gone and I've tested that change and everything is working just great. Okay, so I click on in progress. Yeah, so in order to change that, I'll drop into that, and I can see that now it shows me the metadata of a number of different things. One is the author, and that was me. I was working on it, and I'm done working on it now, so I'll say that I'm finished working. The status is in progress, and I know that I'm ready to approve this change because it was a very simple change. I'm going to say move to approval, and then I can see that my approver status is not reviewed. If I were April, the approver, and I would come in and view this, I could then easily review the change, and I would say, of course, that now I'm ready to approve the changes. It gives me a last-minute dialogue just to confirm the fact that I do want to approve those changes, and I can see now that the status of this is complete. And so let's go back and look at our release, and we can see that now this little progress bar is no longer halfway. It's got a check mark being completely done, and now we're going to be ready to continue on. Now, once I reach this point, all of the activities that I want to do with my release are completed. So I go back to the TLP. I can see that the release is in progress, and I can say proceed to approval for the release itself. We did it prior for the change activity. There's an option of having more than one change activity in any given release. So we go through and we approve it there as well. And so if I come here, I can see that it's ready for approval, right? And that it's not been reviewed. So I'm going to review that release. Notice that this approve is on the release level. I say yes, approve that. And now the approve is completed. The status is completed. And if I go back to the release level, we're going to see that this is in the complete status. Once it reaches that complete status, I can now use this release to deploy to my rule execution server environment. So the next step, the next part of the demo is going to be the whole deployment process. Hang tight and we'll get that set up for you. Okay, so now we're ready to deploy. We're at our TLP Business Console screen in the releases, and we have determined that we want to deploy this new release that we've just made changes to, release 2016-10. So we click on the release, and when we do, there's a whole host of tabs that we can select. One of those is deployment, and we can see that from our rule designer, we've actually created a deployment scenario and included it here. So I click on it, and when I do, I have the ability to deploy just strictly straight from there, or I can go up here at the top bar and click deploy. I'm going to go ahead and click deploy, and you can see that it gives me a dialog, but there's some interesting stuff that's happening. This is the very first time on this server, and it's telling me that the deployment that it knows about are two deployments that are clearly not identified here at this server level, right? So it does not give me the ability to select either one of those. I'm going to hit cancel and go look at my Decision Center Enterprise console for what servers are known to it. Here I have the Enterprise console. I was on here earlier. I'm just hitting refresh. We can see that if I'm working on my TLP governed decision service, it shows up here as an option. I can go to the Configure tab and I can look at what servers are there. Well, what I purposely did was I purposely misspelled that server name out there so that it would not match. And so how I will go and make this fix is I'll click on the Edit tab, remove that X in the front, and then save this again, and then it will indeed know about the same server that I want that deployed to. So now I come back into the business console. You can see my deployment capability is still there. I can hit the little deployment icon, and look, now the server is known, and it autofills it because it knows about it, and that's the only one it knows about. And so now I have the ability to deploy a new version, which is going to be version 1.1, over top of the 1.0, which was clearly deployed from Rule Designer. Okay, so I'm going to hit the Deploy tab, okay, and what it's giving me is a little status that I can check and see what it is from a reporting standpoint. And this is an interesting piece of information. When you do a deployment, you're not just left to wonder. ODM gives you a report that you can look at that gives you some characteristics about the deployment itself. It tells you things like what the configuration name is, what rule set was deployed, things of that nature. Tells you about the rule set and the new version of the decision service. And the important thing here is to remember that this is getting bumped, and kind of remember this number in order to make that call, or if you want to go out to the rule execution server and verify and validate that decision service actually got deployed. So it has told me that there is a successful deployment, and now what I'm going to do is go out and look at the rule execution server environment and verify that version 1.1 is out there. So here I am in my rule execution server environment, and I can see that there's a decision service deployed, the TLP app, and if I drill into that, I can see that the rule sets that are deployed are indeed version 1.0, which got deployed yesterday, and version 1.1, which is what got deployed today. And if you were to compare my clock, you'd see that this is in fact the one that I just deployed. So I can go and take information from that particular decision service, and I can use that to call the decision service with SOAP UI. So I'll go ahead and run that test, and we'll verify externally that the decision service that is out there in the rule execution server is the correct one. Okay, so we're going to test our changes with SOAP UI, but before we do that, let's just do a quick review of what it was that we actually changed. I know it wasn't too long ago, but we can go out there to the TLP into the initial release, and we can see that initially our knowledge suggested that for the pricing tier decision table, if the financial stability is poor and the property risk is not high, then we're going to produce a value of refer. That's all good, but when we actually made our changes, let's go into our release 10 and see what we changed that to. So the same pricing tier table, we can see that poor, not high, was the value of D, which is kind of our new desired output for that particular decision. And also, just to review, if we go out to the rule execution server and we look for our decision service and see that there's a couple of rule sets that are out there, the 1.0, which represents our original release, and 1.1, which represents our change release, you could see there on 2 different days. So let's jump over to SOAP UI. Here we are in SOAP UI. I happen to be using version 5. I've imported the WSDL and created a request. That request has some values in it, and those attributes have assigned values so that they correspond with the particular scenario that I want. So if I actually go and execute version 1.0, which we just saw was the original version of TLP, I can hit the play button, and if I go down, I can see that it does indeed supply the value refer, just like we expected from viewing the decision service over in Decision Center. Now if I want to go in and I'll modify the entry point just one little bit so that it now points not to 1.0 of the rule set but 1.1, which was our change. We then go run it again and look, pricing tier supplies a value of D, exactly what we want, decision service confirmed, ready to call from your various applications. So let's do a final review. We talked today about rule governance at a very high level, talked about some of the value proposition for that, and then we went into these two sections, creating a release and being able to do a deployment, just to show you, to give you a flavor of what it's like to use the rule governance framework in ODM, the product, and be able to handle that for your decision service. Stay tuned for other tech talks, and we'll go into some of these other sections in more detail.